Welcome to Talkless Water, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Butler, and I'm your host for Talkless Water. I'm also principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at waterdisputes.org. In addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas Plus Water and the Texas Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guest today is Chad Berginnis. Chad Berginnis is the executive director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. Chad became executive director of ASFPM in 2012 after joining the association staff as associate director in 2011. As executive director, Chad collaborates frequently with FEMA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and other federal agencies to advocate for effective policies and programs related to mitigating flood risk and strengthening community resilience while protecting our water resources and advancing equity and social justice. Chad has testified before the U.S. House and U.S. Senate committees and subcommittees on a number of topics, including FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program, the Water Resources Development Act of 2020, and on disaster recovery response issues. On December 1st, 2022, Chad began a 3-year appointment to FEMA's National Advisory Council, where he provides a perspective on how we as a nation can best mitigate, prepare, respond, and recover in the face of growing climate threats. The National Advisory Council advises the FEMA administrator on all aspects of emergency management, including preparedness, protection, response, recovery, and mitigation for disasters and national emergencies. Chad has a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from the University of, I ought to say Ohio State University, right? That's the right way to say it.
That's correct.
And so, Chad, welcome to Talkless Water. Thanks for making time to talk with me.
Todd, thank you for the invitation.
So I already broke one of my rules that my listeners know. I gave an acronym without saying what it was. So I'm going to go back and fix that. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. So I fixed that. And so now we're ready to get into your background in water. When did you first become interested in water?
Well, and please don't hold this against me, but as a boy growing up in western Oklahoma, not too far away actually from the Texas Panhandle, of course, water was one of those things that I think as anybody loved to recreate around, loved to fish in, you love to play in, and so just really had been fascinated with it for my entire life. Then as I went into college, I initially wanted to get into fisheries management because, again, I think fishing was something that was really interesting and fisheries. But later, Ohio State was offering this brand new degree program called environmental science. And so thought that would be kind of interesting. And so I focused on water quality and water pollution with the environmental science degree.
Great. And so just thinking about, where you grew up, western Oklahoma, and, I grew up here in Texas and in Dallas, we have a lot of droughts. And I wondered, did that influence any of your kind of interest in water that, okay, we're at a place where water could be, pretty scarce every once in a while?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it seems like out in that area, you're either getting too much at one time or not enough a lot of times. And so, yeah, drought is really kind of the flip side of flooding that way. And but I even remembered some of those ephemeral ponds that would happen. You get a big rainfall in the springtime, and you'd have a pond that exists for a couple weeks. You'd have tadpoles grow up into frogs, and I just thought all of that was so cool to be out and be experiencing that.
I agree, and it seems like most of the folks I interview, they have experiences like that growing up that really kind of shape their career.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of shaping your career, I understand that early in your career, you had an interesting experience that kind of led you to focus on this field. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started working in floodplain management as an intern right out of as I was in college with Ohio's floodplain management program. And after I graduated, went on with a nice job with the state, helping communities and doing that. But early on, I kind of got this itch that I wanted to be closer to the action. And so I took this job as a local official, as a local floodplain manager in a county that had never hired one before. And I was also the county planning director, subdivision coordinator, zoning inspector, and every other hat that they could throw at me.
Oh, wow.
And the weekend before I started the job, we had a massive flood disaster in the county. Because flooding is where I came from, it was an area that I was comfortable with. And I started working with some of the small villages in the county. But long story short, over the next months and years, worked with several communities that were impacted in the flood, and one in particular that I will always remember, Corning, Ohio, small village of less than 1,000 people. 60% of the homes were flooded. And I learned how to do real floodplain management by being a local official, by helping them write a grant application to mitigate the flood risk, and for helping individual families get out of harm's way. And there is nothing more exhilarating, I think, that I've ever done in my career than be able to sit across the coffee table from a family who lost everything and say, look, here's a check to buy out your property. Now get out of harm's way and continue on with the good things that you do. That right there has been the sales point of the purpose of why we do what we do in floodplain management ever since.
That's great. That's great. It's a real baptism by fire, except it's really by a lot of water, right? By daily.
Right.
So I'm just curious. What year was that? Because it sounds like you were doing floodplain buyouts, and I'm just kind of curious. When did that really become a big instrument for floodplain management?
Yeah, so I actually was doing that work in 1998 and 1999, but it really wasn't too many years earlier. It was after the big Mississippi River flood in 1993 that FEMA, and at the time the administrator of FEMA, James Lee Witt, took advantage of some new authorities that Congress gave them under the Federal Stafford Act. And that authorized the ability for FEMA to do buyouts after a disaster. And to Director Witt's credit, he enthusiastically jumped in to that and initiated what has become since the nation's largest buyout effort up along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers after the Great Mississippi River flood of 1993. And so from probably 1994 to 98, 99, you had thousands of buyouts happening along in those states. And so as a nation, we learned how to do those kinds of projects in the 1990s. And so it was really armed with a lot of that knowledge and experience that I was able to help Corning out in that way.
Great. And so let's transition from what you were doing then to what you're doing now. Tell us about the Association of State Floodplain Managers. And, I'm curious about, when it was founded, in addition to what it does.
Yeah. So ASFPM is a national nonprofit 501c3 organization. We have about 7,000 members. We also have 38 chapters, and when you add those members, we're up over 20,000. And one of those, and I just want to give a shout out, is to the Texas Floodplain Managers Association, TFMA, that way. And as an association, our mission is to reduce flood losses in the nation and to recognize, respect, and enhance the natural functions of floodplains. There's a reason that we have floodplains in this country. God put them there for a reason. And they were to flood. And by the way, they have lots of positive effects, replenishing the land, nourishing crops, and doing those kinds of things. I think it's when we get a little too close to floodplains as humans, with all the stuff that we come with, that begins to cause some of the problems. And so, ASFPM, it was kind of interesting in our early days. The main issue that we kind of gravitated around is that there were a number of states in the upper Midwest that had been doing their own flood mapping and had their own state programs that preceded 1968. And the reason that date was important is because 1968 is when Congress passed the National Flood Insurance Act, which created the NFIP, which is kind of the biggest program we have dealing with flood issues. And so those states did not necessarily like the federal government's approach in terms of flood mapping and how they were doing things. And so over the next decade or so, they began to meet and talk, and then began to form as an organization to work with. And at that time, FEMA wasn't in existence. It was HUD that ran the program. And so to work with HUD and then subsequently FEMA on the NFIP, flood mapping issues, and those kinds of things. And so, since those early times when informally some people called us the Midwest Mafia, we've grown to be really a national organization that is known for its policy work, because as a mission-driven organization, we aren't there to advocate for any member interest particularly, or any community's interest. We're there to advocate for good public policy.
So you mentioned something I want to follow up on. I remember, 20 years ago when I was working with floodplain maps. I mean, some of them were had not been updated a long time, and there were real differences between two maps that were supposed to be adjoining to each other, and what areas were in the floodplain and what areas were not. Seems like there has been an effort to really modernize those maps using satellite technology. And so I'm curious, are they, from your perspective, are they much more accurate than when you first started out and were trying to figure out how to manage floodplain issues with what you had available to you compared to what managers have now?
Yeah, Todd, it's funny. Even though flood mapping was probably one of the origin issues for ASFPM, it continues to evolve. And today we still talk an awful lot about flood mapping. But in reference to what you've observed, you are absolutely correct. I remember when I was beginning to get involved with the association in the early 2000s, one of the hottest issues in the country was on flood mapping. And the fact that our technology was beginning to really change a lot, where you had GIS and some of these other ways of doing mapping. The maps were stuck in an older kind of paradigm, and the quality issues were everywhere. And I remember some congressional hearings and things that happened around 2004, 2005, where we would provide testimony. You'd put two maps next to each other, and the floodplain didn't match up or anything like that. And so at that time, there was a FEMA effort called map modernization, and where they invested a lot of resources in fixing the quality issues in the maps. And fast forward to 2024, the thing that I can definitely say is that the quality of the maps, I think, are light years ahead today of what they were at that time. Now, that's not to say we still don't have some unmodernized maps or even areas that's not been mapped yet, but FEMA has really focused and done a good job on improving them.
Well, I remember a specific case when I was actually working in D.C. I was working for a federal agency, and they had a floodplain map that was relatively new, and then they had an old one. And on the old one, it didn't show any wetlands where they had their facility. And the new one showed wetlands. And so I actually had somebody at the agency who was like, hey, can't we say we create all these wetlands that show up on this new map? And I was like, well, no, you can't. I mean, you didn't. It's a better map, right? And so it's a better reflection of reality than what you used to have. But those mapping issues I know have been a big headache for a lot of people in the past, and it's good that so much progress has been made in that area. And before we go too far, probably should talk about you know, what we really mean when we talk about floodplain management. I mean, how would you describe that as a field?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that, Todd, because when I talk to my mom sometimes, she in the early days, my mom liked to refer to ASFPM as kind of the flood club. She didn't even understand what I did so much. And actually, a lot of people, when I tell them what I do, they come up and they said, "So, you help people, you help respond when a flood event occurs." And I'm like, "Well, not really. That's your first responders." It's like, "Oh, well, do you manage the water?" I'm like, "Well, not really a whole much. That's your operators, your dams, and things like that." What floodplain management is about is managing the resource of the floodplain um, before, during, after any kind of flood event. And so I like to say most of our work as floodplain managers is done on the sunny days. It's administering land use and zoning controls and building codes to make sure that what we put in the floodplain actually is resistant to flooding. It's doing planning work to identify at-risk infrastructure and structures and come up with plans on how to mitigate or reduce that risk. Um, it absolutely can also be about helping respond. If you're a local floodplain manager, you wear those multiple hats. And that means that probably part of your work is also being in your local emergency operations center, helping out and doing those kinds of things. But floodplain management really is about that longer term view on making sure we have healthy floodplains, healthy communities, and a population that isn't at such risk to exposure to those devastating events.
Thinking about it, I think most people would be surprised, but there's an amazing amount of building that's taken place in the 1% floodplain, and which we used to call the 100-year floodplain, which we don't do that anymore because people think that means you're not going to have another flood for another 100 years after you have one. But the area where you have a 1% chance of a flood every year, and we're kind of, I guess, still in the process of, I don't even know how far you could say we are in the process of trying to get buildings that are in harm's way moved out. And you mentioned earlier about buying out property owners who have homes, but it's just not. It's not only people who have homes; it's all sorts of buildings you find in the floodplain.
Yeah. So really, you're right. And it's not just buildings, right? It's infrastructure.
Right.
It's things like fire stations. And these are the things that make me want to scream at night. It's things like nursing homes and hospitals. For some reason, we as a society don't make wise choices when it comes to putting things like critical infrastructure in harm's way. But the first step that we've got to kind of go back to, and this is why the mapping is just so important and foundational, is we've got to map all the floodplains that exist. And on one hand, while in the United States, we probably have the world's largest repository of flood map data, we've only mapped about 1.3 million miles of stream, rivers, and coastlines. We have about 3 million miles of stream, rivers, and coastlines. So we've mapped a third of them. Now, if you count that another third might be on federal lands, you still have at least half of them in developable areas that we've not mapped. That's one. But then second, once we've identified those, we've got to have appropriate controls, codes, and standards so that we know, so that we're able to, if we're going to choose to build there, do it wisely that way. And that goes again, a lot of people immediately leap to residential homes, but it could be your businesses. I mean, and we also have history, right? As a civilization here in the United States, as a society, in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, we built around water courses. Why? Because those helped transport goods and materials. We recreated around those. It was the source of our drinking water, also the source sometimes of our effluent that way. But that's how we organically grew around. And a lot of that old stuff is absolutely at risk too. So we have an issue. I kind of like to segment it as the at-risk existing environment and the yet-to-be-built environment. And we've got to address both of those simultaneously.
You mentioned a number of types of infrastructure you find in floodplains. One that I've had some experience with here in Central Texas that's been really problematic is having water treatment plants and wastewater treatment plants in floodplains, which, they're close. They're in the floodplains because, the source is a river, right? And they built those plants near whatever river that is. But then when you have a big flood and your water treatment plant gets flooded, you're unable to provide, clean drinking water to the public. And so, that's one in particular that we've had some issues with here in Central Texas. And I imagine that South Central Texas, I should say. And I imagine it's probably not unique in that regard.
Todd, you're absolutely right. I think the issue you just talked about with water or wastewater treatment in Central Texas, you could take anywhere in rural America and many places in America for that matter that way. One of the roles I had earlier in my career is I would review big projects like that at the state level. And like you said, I think the popular thought is that you've got to locate these facilities right next to the water courses. Well, no, you don't. Technologically, we figured out that you don't have to do that. Now, could that raise the cost because you have to add a pumping station? Yes. But ultimately, isn't that a lower cost than having it right there at risk, as opposed to having a pumping station that might be at risk? That's a much larger infrastructure investment, or much smaller infrastructure investment. But I would just have to argue sometime with communities and say, look, you are making the single largest infrastructure investment in the history of your community, a couple $1 million, and you're going to put it at risk? Why not add a little extra cost to make sure that you're elevating it, that you're relocating it, or that you don't have it in harm's way? And again, I think it's still a fight that that we deal with today.
Right. So let's pivot back to the Association of State Floodplain Managers. Now, what are some of the accomplishments of ASFPM that you're the most proud of?
Well, when I kind of think back of the association, there are probably two main things that really come to mind that way. And one of those is our certification program, and also called the Certified Floodplain Manager. And in the middle 90s, a couple of states, including Texas, actually was one of the forerunners here. We're working on this idea of certifying floodplain managers, basically because our field was evolving, and it took a lot more experience and background than one might think to do your job well. And so we wanted to raise the bar across the country that way. And so in working with those states and nationally, we came up with a Certified Floodplain Manager program in the late 90s. And today, we now have over 10,000 certified floodplain managers practicing in the country. And why that's so important is because I think when you're able to talk to a CFM, they generally are going to have a much broader knowledge on your flooding issue, the possible solutions to your flooding, as well as being able to have a more informed discussion if you need technical assistance or otherwise that way. So, our CFM program, I'm not sure there's many accomplishments that I could say are bigger than that. But if there's anything else that I would say, it would probably be our ongoing work in reforming the National Flood Insurance Program. ASFPM is probably the only organization that's out there that has been part of NFIP reform legislation since the 1980s. We've been doing it a long time. We've been providing input, providing that practitioner feedback saying, Congress, hey, you're doing this law up here, but this is how it impacts communities and states. And there's a number of changes that we were able to get in the law that I'm very proud of. I think at ASFPM and certainly in the 90s, one component of the program called the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, where it provides grants for at-risk buildings. That was one of the ideas that we initially worked on. Also, there's a special coverage called increased cost of compliance that helps provide homeowners extra money for if they have to comply with the local codes. And then also our work on establishing actually kind of minimum requirements for FEMA's flood mapping program. Those are a couple of the big reforms that we really helped lead and get into the law.
Well, now that you've introduced the topic of the National Flood Insurance Program, how do you think that program's performing overall?
So one of the things you'll never hear me say at ASFPM, and there's a couple camps here, I will never say that this program is somehow hopelessly or irretrievably broken. I think you do have some folks that would say, "Oh my gosh, look at this, look at the debt in the program, or look at how this part is failing. It is broken beyond repair. We've got to drastically reform and do that." And again, as I had said earlier, because we've been part of reform for 30 plus years. We know that change comes incrementally, and we also know that even with its warts, it is a pretty darn good program. I mean, think about this. What is the most widely adopted land use or building regulation in this country? It's not subdivision codes. It's not zoning codes. It's not even building codes. It's floodplain management codes, because a requirement of the NFIP is every participating community has to adopt a code. It's one of these really unique kind of elements to the program. I said earlier, we have probably the world's largest repository of flood mapping data. Is it complete? No. But the NFIP caused that to happen. The nation's largest single line property insurer is the National Flood Insurance Program. I think it insures now over $1 trillion in property. So again, it is a program that does need some reforms, but also I think has been relatively successful.
So are the properties that can be insured under NFIP? Do you often see that NFIP is the only option for insuring them, or because you hear about some states are having struggling with their insurance programs after natural disasters. And so I'm just curious about that. Is that really the only place to go, or does it just depend on what state you're in?
So it depends on what your state you're in, but it also kind of depends on flood insurance availability over time. When I first started my career in the 1990s, we knew that there were private insurers willing to write flood insurance. Now, mainly it was more for mobile homes at that time. But then I think in the 2000s, late 90s, 2000s, where we had a lot of big flood events, you could scarcely find private flood insurers at all out there. And then starting in 2012, Congress made a series of reforms in the program that were to encourage private flood. And now today, what you have, I think, is probably the most diverse mix of insurance opportunities. You do have private insurers, I think, in most places in the country for flood. However, the NFIP is always that steady Eddie that's there regardless of whether private flood comes or goes.
So is it kind of a case of, well, you could have coverage under an NFIP, but you might also have coverage under a private insurer, or is it usually one or the other?
You know what? It actually, both scenarios are totally plausible. Okay, so for instance, if you have a house worth $500,000, the maximum residential limit, I believe, is $250,000. And if your outstanding loan, if your lender says you need more than that, you're going to need to have either a private policy to cover all of it, or you can have NFIP cover the first 250 and then get an excess policy on top of that. And that's one of the reforms that we'd like to see, is that the policy limits of the program were last changed maybe 20 years ago. And we need to have policy limits just to make it easier on people, so they don't have to buy two policies if they want.
Well, let's go ahead and get into the improvements you'd like to see in FIP. What besides raising that limit, I guess from 250 to some other limit, what are some of the other things that you'd like to see changed in the National Flood Insurance Program?
Well, probably one of the first ones, and this shouldn't be any surprise for folks that have been looking or seeing the headlines in the property insurance market, is there is a huge upheaval happening in property insurance right now. People are getting kicked off policies. Policies are becoming unaffordable. And even within the NFIP, FEMA underwent a rating method change about 2 years ago. And the new rating system, while it is absolutely fixing some inequities in the program, it also is exacerbating some affordability issues. And we have been sounding the alarm for well over a decade about flood insurance affordability, but we are at the point that really Congress needs to do something to help those that can't afford it with flood insurance. And there's a couple different ideas on how to do that. Whether it's a subsidy or there's some legislation I think introduced by some members in the Florida congressional members, as some tax credits or something like that. So flood insurance affordability is definitely one. Making sure that the actual policy is easy for people to use, to obtain, do those kinds of things. Some reforms along those lines would be good. Increased cost of compliance. The cost to elevate a building that's been substantially damaged and has to come into compliance with code, the cost to do that is well over $100,000 now. ICC only gives you up to $30,000. So that coverage limit needs to go up. So again, people aren't paying out of pocket to be to do that. We need to expand the flood mapping program and modernize that. There's some new, cheaper ways of doing things that we need to make sure are reflected in the law, using automated methods and some of the LIDAR and the new technology. And then finally, I would say the whole kind of financial soundness of the program. FEMA's been chipping away at this now for 10 years based on some things Congress wanted it to do, whether it's buy reinsurance, whether it's having a solvency fund, whether it's changing its rating system. But the fact is, we're going to have these big extreme events happen that go beyond the ability of the program to pay it. And we just need to have a mechanism where in those really extreme events that the program can go ahead and move forward without having to carry this huge amount of debt that then Congress just beats it over the head with. I mean, at the end of the day, our U.S. crop insurance program in this country is subsidized to the tune of almost $10 billion per year by taxpayers. The NFIP, people are getting policies and things, but we've got to also recognize we have extreme events that go beyond the program's ability to pay for it, and we need to figure out a better way for that.
So, thinking about what you just said there, some of the things, talking about technology to update floodplain maps. One thing I think it's worth mentioning is that the floodplain's changing all the time as we change land uses upstream, and so there's a need not only to have the most accurate maps based on the improving technology, but also to reflect that changes in the watershed upstream are changing the potential for flooding downstream.
Absolutely, yes. And one of the reforms that we want to see much more strongly in the law is just the mandate for flood mapping to incorporate those future conditions, right? Because future conditions can happen one of two ways. It's either the climate condition changes or the land use condition. And oftentimes it's both. So if you have a watershed that is hardening, that has more pavement and driveways and everything else, that's more runoff, that's going to contribute to increased flood risk. At the same time, the data is very clear that in this country, even in our arid areas, we are receiving more intense rainfall events, even if it means less rainfall overall. But that also means more flooding. And we've got to understand what that future condition is so that we set our codes appropriately, so that if I'm making my biggest personal investment building a house in 2024, that it's going to be relatively safe from flooding 30, 50 years from now, because that house is certainly going to be around.
So every once in a while, I'll hear arguments from people who say, well, we really shouldn't have national flood insurance program because it encourages people to build in places they shouldn't because they can get insured that way. I don't know. To me, it seems like most of the building has already taken place in the floodplains, and we're having to deal with that. But do you ever hear that argument from lawmakers when you're talking to them about changes that are necessary?
Yes, and that argument has been around as long as I've been in this field. Or the question, does the NFIP ultimately lead to more development or less development? And in 2005, the program underwent a comprehensive evaluation by the American Institutes of Research, and it could not make a conclusion to that effect that way. And the reality is because the situation is so different in every community and every state that it's hard to jump to that conclusion. But also anecdotally, we have areas in the country, in our coastal areas, called coastal barrier resource systems, COBRA zones. In those areas, flood insurance, NFIP flood insurance is prohibited. Yet we have development in those COBRA zones. Because why? Well, people can finance privately and people can get insurance privately now. So the NFIP then is a non-factor. The availability of the insurance is non-factor. So then I'd ask myself, okay, if today, and especially when we have a thriving private flood insurance market, if that's the case, is it not better to at least have good standards and regulations and codes that govern the development in your floodplains versus not having those? And that's what you get with the NFIP, because again, it's not just an insurance program. It's a land use management program. It's a mapping program. It's a mitigating existing at-risk structure program.
Gotcha. So let's turn to what floodplain managers are doing and what they're facing. What do you think are some of the key challenges you see for your local floodplain managers?
Well, probably one of the hardest jobs, and we have some floodplain managers in Florida right now kind of dealing with this situation, is after a flood disaster, doing the things you need to do to break the cycle of damage, repair, damage again. So in flood codes, one of the hardest jobs that a floodplain manager has is going to buildings and determining whether they've been called substantially damaged. That means damaged more than 50% of the value of the building. If it is, the structure should get red tagged, and basically no repairs can happen unless it's brought into compliance with the code. For residential, that means elevating it. For non-residential, you could dry floodproof it as well. The practical reality is that is quite costly to do. And if you don't have insurance, it's going to even be more difficult to do those things. And so I remember this as a local official doing those determinations, but also here at ASFPM, hearing the stories of our local floodplain managers. There's no responsibility you have day to day that is as hard as that one, right? Because you have your political leaders saying, no, take it easy on people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the law is the law, and you got to follow the code. So that's I would say that's one thing. The other things are not unlike what I think building officials and others have to deal with, whether it's political support from the elected leaders in their community, to making sure that you have good legal counsel and good kind of enforcement procedures should you have violations and things like that, and also just simply not enough resources. Most local officials, they want to do the right thing. They wear 10 different hats, and there's only one of them. And
Right.
so, a lot of local officials are resource constrained.
Well, when you're telling me all that you were responsible for in your first job there, the only thing you left out was dog catcher. I think I was like counting up all the things you said.
Right.
How's one person do all that? So you covered some of these challenges that your local floodplain managers are facing. What are some of the programs that ASFPM has to help them out?
Sure. So in implementing the mission of ASFPM, and I touched on a couple of things that we do. We do our policy work. We run the CFM program that increases the competence of floodplain managers all across the board. But then some of the other work we do is ASFPM is a flood science center that does applied research, develops tools and job aids for floodplain managers to simply do their job better. One of the tools that we developed a couple years ago was an elected officials guide to floodplain management, so that if you're a new mayor, a new county commissioner, you could use the guide. It included video testimonies, for example, of other mayors and county officials saying, "Geez, I learned about this, and this is how it happened." So we have that. We've developed, worked on some higher standard subdivision regulations that can be included in any community subdivision standards to make them more flood resilient that way. We also have now increased a lot of our training capability. We're trying to meet floodplain managers where they are. A lot of times they may not have the ability to go to big conferences or events. And so instead, we have an on-demand, the ability to do on-demand courses, webinars, and those kinds of things. So we try to really help out floodplain managers where they're at in doing in doing all the different work that they do.
So we talked about local floodplain managers now, and also about federal programs before that. What roles does the state have in floodplain management? When I worked for the River Authority, I remember reading our Enabling Act, and it mentioned flooding in there, but we really didn't do that much with flooding. We helped to get the word out about it and help pass warnings down the line from the Corps of Engineers or for the River Forecast Center from the National Weather Service, something like that. But at least our agency in Texas, when it came to flooding, we typically would say, well, really the Army Corps of Engineers is the organization that you really need to talk to. But that may not be the case for every state. So how would you describe the state's role?
Well, the state role is incredibly important, and I think going forward is increasingly so. So kind of backing up the framework we have the big federal NFIP. The NFIP itself actually requires that states designate an office to be the state coordinator of the program. So every state has one of those designated. And then you have your army of, community officials that are implementing the program locally that way. But remember, I said at the top of our conversation that some states had programs that predated the NFIP because, quite honestly, flooding was an issue. In any state, you can pass state laws to help out, to complement the programs, or to even fill the gaps that don't exist. We have a lot of states right now that have their own hazard mitigation programs to provide grant funding for at-risk buildings. We have other states that have higher regulatory standards so that they require buildings to be elevated higher than the national minimum standards. And then we have other states that have improved their disclosure laws and things like that as well. I'm particularly proud of Texas after Harvey, though, because after Harvey, the governor set up, of course, a commission on helping improve floodplain management. I was fortunate to be invited to some of those initial conversations. And I just saw noticed, I think last month, that the first state of Texas flood plan is coming out this month in May for comment and everything. And that's the culmination of several years' work. So states are incredibly important and are going to be more so in the future.
That's right. We're really looking forward to the results of this first round of planning for flooding, the way Texas has been doing for regional water supplies through our state water planning process, which is a 5-year process. And so that's a whole another episode coming up of Talk with Water, let me tell you. So one program that ASFPM is participating in is the Biden administration's recently announced America the Beautiful Challenge, which, among other things, focuses on conserving and restoring rivers, coasts, wetlands, and watersheds, and improving ecosystem and community resilience to coastal flooding, drought, and other climate-related threats. Please tell us about that program. Very interested in it. Saw the information related to the rollout, but I don't know too many of the details about what it'll be doing.
Right. Yes. So the America the Beautiful Freshwater Challenge is something that we were approached by the administration to see if we were interested in. And it really is this partnership, right, to conserve and restore our rivers, our lakes and streams and wetlands that way. As I said earlier, ASFPM, part of our mission is to recognize, preserve, and respect the natural functions of floodplains. Well, you don't need to look any further than our stream, rivers, estuaries, wetlands to show that all of those, most of them, are in floodplains that way. And so it's kind of in our DNA as an organization to be concerned and to work towards those kinds of things. And so the Freshwater Challenge basically is to reconnect, restore, and protect 8 million acres of wetlands by 2030. And also reconnect, restore, and protect 100,000 miles of nation's rivers and streams by 2030, using approaches like removal of impediments and stream bank restoration in those. And I've been kind of struck, especially in the last couple years, when the Supreme Court struck down in the Sackett decision the protection of a lot of our wetlands that maybe aren't quite as closely associated, right adjacent to streams and things. So we are talking internally about some of the different approaches that we want to emphasize. But again, a lot of our members, for instance, know how to do good land use management. And so we have examples of where communities have used their authorities to be able to protect those wetlands that maybe have lost federal protection now, but under their floodplain management code or under their riparian codes or something, they still can give that protection. So how can we transfer that knowledge to other communities so that they can at least take the steps and fill in that gap where the federal government didn't? We also want to make sure that federal programs are recognizing and supporting doing these more natural approaches to reducing flood risk. And so we work with multiple agencies, whether it's the Corps of Engineers, and encouraging them that instead of having a levee right on the bank of the river, why not have a setback levee, improve the riparian area, the levee is smaller, and you're also improving the function of floodplains. So whether it's by agency or by program, or even leveraging the expertise of our state and local communities, I think that we're well positioned to be able to be helpful to the administration.
Well, I'm glad you told me what all was involved, because we have been very interested in wetlands in this podcast, and actually have a program that we did taking a look at the Sackett decision and trying to think about the impacts from that. And of course, one of my concerns obviously was, if people are going to be filling in more wetlands, that means there's less places for the water to collect. And so it's going to run off downstream faster, and you're going to have worse flooding downstream. And so, I'm glad that there is a look at a comprehensive approach to managing floodplains and wetlands and watersheds. I mean, I thought about this a lot. I've started writing an essay, and I had a great title for it. It's something like Riparian Renaissance or something like that. Talking about here, all these programs the last few years have been focused on wetlands and floodplains and how there is a growing understanding that so many problems that we have right now that we're trying to address, water supply, water quality, biodiversity, climate change, and not to mention flooding, right? I mean, are related to wetlands and floodplains. And so it just seems like that a focus on that going forward is a smart way to go, because there are a lot of people, I think, on both sides of the aisle, so to say, so to speak, that recognize that floodplains are places where we recreate, and all sorts of activities are happening, and there's a growing sense that this flooding that we're experiencing can be reduced or maybe somewhat attenuated if we do a better job of taking care of our floodplains. And so it sounds like this program is oriented towards doing just that.
Yeah, Todd, I totally agree with you. And I think what's really amazing is that you don't need a presidentially led initiative to take actions in your own community. And again, because of my experience, I'm very familiar with local land use and codes and standards. And so one of the projects that we had done a few years ago in partnership with the American Planning Association was produce a document called Subdivision Design in Flood-Prone Areas. But it's really taking a holistic look at subdivision design, right? Because most of our housing in this country now is in big subdivisions. And so that's where the growth is happening. It's happening on those little streams and things that maybe are mapped, maybe they're not. But if we take a more intentional approach to design, a more intentional approach to riparian areas as we're developing the land, we can achieve all of those goals. And you're absolutely right. Republicans, Democrats, independents love to recreate around water. Flooding hammers Republicans, Democrats, independents, liberals, conservatives. It hammers us all. It is in our society's interest to get this right.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to our final question. So, Chad, how can our listeners find out more about the Association of State Floodplain Managers?
Well, probably the easiest way is we try to put everything on our website at floods, FLOODS.org. And on there, you can find information, anything from our training programs to the all of our publications that we have, our job aids, the research that we're doing. If you want to be a certified floodplain manager, and how to do that as well. Certainly, we encourage you to be a member of our national organization. But if you're not ready to take that step and you're there listening in Texas, again, the Texas Floodplain Managers Association is a wonderful state-based organization to get involved with. And so would encourage your listeners to check them out.
Floods.org. Somebody was on the ball and grabbed that URL. When URLs were going fast, it sounds like that was somebody deserves some extra points for doing that.
Absolutely.
Well, Chad, thank you for joining us today on Talkless Water.
Todd, it's my pleasure.
This has been Talkless Water, and my guest was Chad Berginnis, the Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. I want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. And I want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talkless Water ready to go. And just say, if you enjoyed our discussion today, please consider leaving us a review to let us know. My name is Todd Bottler. Let's talk water again soon.